This is really a follow-on to a previous urban cultures debate that we had in the summer, where we were looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the places that we live, how we think about homes, and what might be next for those. And one of the things that came out of that was this idea that there might be alternative approaches to provision of homes, places to live, which could start to tackle issues of affordability, alternative uses of land and land availability, and how we make homes as well. And it could start to tackle issues of sustainability, both economic, environmental, and social. So this session, really what we want to do is to very briefly sort of talk around that a little bit. And also, we're delighted to have visiting Professor George Clarke here to sort of introduce the issues. Then we will hear from Arthur Kay, who is CEO of Skyroom. He's an urban designer and business leader looking at creating sustainable cities. He founded the clean technology manufacturing business BioBean and think tank Fast Forward 2030. He lectures at Imperial College London and UCL, where he is the entrepreneur in residence. And thanks very much for joining us, Arthur. And then following that, we have Kim Cherwell, who is an architect at Cherwell District Council's Build team, which have been really looking at how self-build and alternative models of housing production can make a change in tackling affordability and social aspects of sustainability, and how those could be married with long-term sustainability as well. And we'll be talking about a project that we've been running in the school for about the last 2 years in collaboration with the Build team at Cherwell. So thank you for joining us. George. George, would you be able to quickly give us your view on the sort of state of housing and why potentially we need to think about alternatives to maybe mainstream housing provision?
You used the word quickly there. I'm not sure if I can do that quickly, but I'll try. It's an enormous issue, really. I mean, I think with that, I don't think it would be an overstatement to say that the housing crisis is probably one of the space in the country. Obviously, we've got a global pandemic which has taken priority at the minute, but I think linked to the housing crisis, you're also going to have an effective poverty crisis, and I think poverty and housing are linked. And I also think the climate crisis that we have is linked to housing directly as well. Obviously, you could blame the climate crisis on many, many other things, but housing is quite staggering when you look at the statistics, really. I mean, let's just stick with the UK, and that might give me a chance of keeping it brief rather than being global. In the UK, we've got kind of 25, 26 million houses. Many of those were built many years ago. We're roughly building just over 200,000 houses a year at the moment. So less than 1% of the overall existing housing stock is new build. Then if you start looking at the new builds and the quality of the new build in Britain, I've got to be careful what I say here because I get myself into lots of trouble. Let's just say a very small percentage of that is good architecture and ecological and genuinely sustainable. The vast majority of it is, I think, relatively substandard in comparison with the way that we could and should be building houses today. A lot of the big house builders control the market. You know, you've got kind of 8 or 9 very, very big house builders, big kind of PLCs with enormous shareholders who are quite demanding, to the point where you could argue that the property game has become about making substantial profits and homes being commodities. I think because of that, that's why I call them noddy box housing estates. You've got lots of noddy box housing estates that sprout up everywhere. And a lot of the developers will claim that a certain percentage of them are affordable. I'm not quite sure people fully understand what affordable really means today in the housing industry. So you've got this kind of horrible perfect storm in some ways of the government passionate about numbers. So it's how many we build, not necessarily what we build or how we build them. Just get as many built as you possibly can so we can make grand announcements that we've built many more houses. We've got a government that's obsessed by home ownership. They do struggle with other forms of tenure. They certainly don't think that the state should be building again. And in fairness, they say, well, everybody should own a home, and they're pushing for home ownership. Well, I couldn't agree more. If absolutely everybody in the country could own a home, that would be absolutely amazing. But that's just completely unachievable for so many people out there. So I think when you've got a government pushing for numbers, not necessarily quality, I don't think we're building with a long-term strategic view. And you look at the targets that the government set about us being zero carbon by 2050. I've got no idea how we're going to do that in housing at the current rate of change. You've basically got the climate crisis at a supersonic scale. The government are making some moves on that, albeit slowly. Gas boilers are just about to be banned on new build properties in the next few years. That's one small step, but that should have been taken ages ago. The Scandinavians kind of laugh at us really when it comes to building regulation standards, because we're probably about the same level where they were in about 1978, and we're in 2021 coming up to. So you've got this scenario where we've got a massive housing waiting list, over 1.15 million people on the housing waiting list. You've got over 350,000 people at the minute as homeless. You've got 100,000 children living in temporary accommodation at the moment. You've got a massive retrofit challenge with the 20 million existing houses that we have that be upgraded. And you've also got an industry which is not necessarily building what the market wants. And that's why, quite depressingly, we're in the state that we're in. Now, on a more positive note, there's some wonderful work being done, some brilliant work being done, some real innovation when it comes to multifunctional spaces, small space design, how we might live differently. And obviously this has come up during the pandemic as well, because most people are staying at home and most people are now working from home. I can see most of you now. So how we live and how we work in our homes is going to be an interesting debate over the next few years. So there are some brilliant things being done, some great innovation being done, even in universities. But the rate of change out there in the market is staggeringly slow. And to meet all the targets that have been set, and I think also to create genuine communities that people really feel part of, with good quality external spaces, green spaces, green buildings, and well-designed homes, we're kind of miles off where we should be. And that's why I think it's one of the biggest challenges really for the 21st century. We've got the skills, we've got the talent, we've got the know-how, we've got the expertise, but it's not happening at scale, and that's going to change.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, George. So thinking about how we might change that, let's hand over to our first speakers. So Arthur Kay, who is CEO of Skyroom. Arthur, are you okay to share your screen and talk us through your presentation? Thanks very much.
This works. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
Super. Well, George, thank you for framing some of the challenges so succinctly.
It was a bit depressing. Sorry about that. But anyway, I'm sure you'll turn it into a positive now, Arthur.
No, absolutely. Well, I'm sure you could have gone on for a long time because, yeah, as you said, kind of scratching the surface there. And I think it's such a it's such a broad subject to address. I think I'm going to spend today really, I think for an architecture lecture, I'm going to spend it not talking about architecture at all, but talking about what led me down this route, and specifically some of the economic challenges that sit at the base of this. Because the way I was doing my undergraduate architecture studies in London at UCL, and what led me down this route was hearing kind of in passing a tutor saying kind of, well, it's not actually the architecture that's the hard thing to get right. Most of it's down to the economics of land. And I heard this phrase, I never really, at the time, never thought much of it. But I think if there's one thing that you remember from, I guess, my kind of 10 minutes or so today, it's really kind of looking at the fundamental structures of how we've got here, and specifically around this idea of the economics of land. That sounds so boring. And so I'm going to try and put some flesh on the bones of what I mean by that and why it's such an important piece. So this graph here, I was born in 1990, so it gives a neat build up to today. But this graph here broadly shows the average cost of a home in London over the 30 years, the last 30 years. And this is a really, really important graph, mainly to illustrate the changes in the end price of a home to the end user. And equivalent graphs can be drawn when we look at it from a rental perspective as well. But critically also in terms of the build cost, which is the white line, the white bar along the bottom there. And broadly, everyone always has a go at, well, everyone has a go at everyone, to be honest, whether it be government, whether it be developers, whether it be architects, whether it be engineers. There are a whole bunch of problems in this space. But if we look at this from what's known from a business perspective as a unit cost, what is the cost of delivering a unit of anything, whether it be a bottle of beer, or whether it be a home, or whether it be a new microwave, there's the cost of what it costs to produce that thing. And it's really important to understand this from a fundamental principles basis, or first principles basis, because the economics of how we get to the point of a very expensive home ownership and price to the end user is almost all in the cost of the land. And so if we look at London, that's very extreme because London is a very expensive place to live, but equivalent the equivalent challenge exists all over the country and generally exists in major cities and urban centres all over the world. And so what that looks like is really crudely, we often hear the title or the soundbite, we have a housing crisis, and my contention today and what I say the big point I'm keen that you guys are left with is that we don't have a housing crisis, we have and even more specifically, but much less.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay? Hopefully you can still hear me.
Yeah,
a bit of
that's fine.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Super. So we don't have a housing crisis, we have a land crisis. And even more specifically, but this is why this doesn't get a Guardian headline title, because it's actually quite a boring subject, is we have a cost of suitable urban building land crisis. And so the challenge, a big part, as Matthew mentioned in the introduction, I've spent my career thus far building entrepreneurial businesses, first a renewable energy company and since this technology and development company. And the really difficult thing with setting up companies and early stage businesses is coming up with what's known as a problem statement. And the key with that is being very specific with the problem that you're trying to solve, which can then mean that you develop a very specific solution to it. And so the specific solution we try to create, the specific problem we try to create a solution to with the company that I founded, Skyroom, is how do you make suitable urban building land 10 times less expensive, but staying in the center of the city? So it's a very, very niche problem. And the way that we've gone about trying to solve that is by buying certain plots of land at 10 times less than one could typically buy it. And we do that by partnering with major landlords in London to buy airspace above existing buildings. And you can buy airspace, well, buy is probably a strange word for it, but you can acquire or partner on airspace for between 10 times and 20 times less than you can buy a plot of land. And so you can see from that we've started with a problem which is around identifying the unit economics of land ownership, narrowed that down into a specific problem statement around suitable urban building land and how do you make that significantly less expensive? And then a solution, which in our case is how do we unlock airspace development, but stay in the centre of cities? And then this then is kind of what that then looks like. George, you'll be familiar with one of the architecture firms we work with, TDO, who, and as of, I think, Matthew, you probably reached out on the back of seeing the Architecture Journal article on us, which was as of the 17th of November, we secured our first planning permission to deliver 15 new homes in the airspace above a building in London Borough of Southwark. And that's the project there that TDO designed for us. So this is an example of one of the buildings. It's a 3-storey block of flats currently, and we're adding 4 stories in the airspace above it. So it's significant massing increase, over 100% in terms of new massing, and again looking specifically at delivering that affordability to the end user. What that looks like from it, in terms of who specifically we're trying to provide new homes for, our specific focus is delivering homes for key workers, and our mission statement and theory of change is trying to deliver new homes to key workers near to where they work. And that's we wrote a white paper on that subject, so I'm not going to bore you with the details of that now. But broadly, it's looking around how key workers, need to work in cities for cities to function, but too often they can't afford to live in cities that they actually support, and even if they do work in those cities, end up with very, very high housing costs and very long commutes. And so our theory of change is trying to provide these inner city rooftop homes at affordable prices, built to incredibly high quality and beautiful architectural design, but critically affordable and near to where they work, so as we can make that kind of compounding and cascading effect to society. So,
Arthur, can I jump in and ask you a question, or am I not allowed to do that? When you say affordable, and obviously you've made a massive reduction in the land value, and you've built something really beautiful at quite a high standard, how much cheaper are those apartments compared to the ones underneath them that would have been built associated with land?
Yeah, so it depends apartment to apartment, but broadly we're looking at between a 50% and a 30% reduction in price, depending on which registered provider takes it on.
50%?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So, I mean, with they're all targeted at first-time buyer key workers, and then the ones that aren't for sale are managed through registered providers at London Living Rent or social rents.
Fantastic. Sorry for the interruption.
No, good question. And you're right, George, in terms of what affordable means. There's obviously all manner of sins are kind of pushed into that increasingly baggy bag of what affordable means, and so it's quite important to be specific on that. And so, I mean, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but broadly, legislation is following this trend of the potential of airspace development, which is obviously fantastic for your winter project of looking at a rooftop retreat. I'll guide you, if anyone's interested. Perhaps Matthew could circulate a link, an online version where there's a lot of research in terms of our white paper, which you can read at riseup.skyroom.london. But one of the kind of headline figures is that a 2014 report by the engineering firm WSP estimated that London alone could, if the airspace above suitable municipal buildings was developed, could unlock 630 new homes, 30,000 new homes. And in terms of what that looks like in real terms, that would comfortably deliver Greater London's 2030 housing targets. So I said broadly, we need to house 1 million new Londoners by 2030, and this would comfortably do that. And our model of development is not to go out and buy buildings and do it all ourselves. Our model is to partner with London's local authorities and housing associations to do this. In doing so, we've actually just recently raised a large fund. It's called the Key Worker Homes Fund. We've just raised over £100 million for that, and we're going to be investing that capital alongside local authorities and housing associations to build these homes for key workers over the next decade or so. So that's the whistle-stop tour through our approach to delivering more homes for key workers, but specifically from a affordable, beautiful, sustainable homes. And I think in terms of, as I say, I'm not bizarrely for an architecture lecture, interested in you guys learning more or thinking more about the architecture of it. It's, I think, a really important place to start with all problems and all architectural projects is really working on identifying what is the problem you're trying to solve, who are you trying to solve that problem for, and investing a lot of time in writing a very specific problem statement. Our problem statement was around the cost of land, that around this what we believe is a misnomer, a incorrect attribution of saying there's a housing crisis. We say no, there's not a housing crisis. There is a cost of suitable urban building land crisis. Much less snappy headline. But if we can take that approach to trying to identify where the specific problem is, we can then come up with creative solutions as to how we can tackle it. So I'm going to stop sharing screen, and either can answer questions now, or we can dive in at the end after hearing from Kim.
Well, maybe if there are any burning questions now, we could have those straight away before we move on to our second presenter. Does anyone have a burning question? Gemma, you've put your hand up.
Hi there. I just thought I'd ask it quickly because it might not relate to the bigger picture. And I know you were saying, thanks, by the way, Arthur, that was fantastic. Really interesting to hear about your project. And I know you said, you didn't want us to take away questions around the architecture, but more of those bigger questions. And I completely agree with you. However, I am just really intrigued to know some practicalities as to how you kind of get around the access to the new apartments and fire safety concerns and things like that. No great detail, but I wouldn't mind just a tiny little bit of an insight into that, if that's okay.
Definitely a really good question, because it's all very well coming up with a clever solution, but if it's not actually possible to live in it from a bunch of different perspectives, it's irrelevant. So it's a great question. There's a whole, as you'd imagine, there are an awful lot of complexities in delivering any home, and the complexities of doing one in the airspace above an existing building, particularly in a dense urban environment, is very challenging. So we have hundreds of different constraints with each project. So that can be things like the obvious ones, like access, structural integrity, fire safety, building control, planning, rights to light, daylight, sunlight. The list goes on and on. We broadly we've developed something we would call a geospatial mapping technology. It's a proprietary technology we developed with funding from Innovate UK, Land Registry, and the Geospatial Commission. That's a piece of software which helps us rapidly identify suitable buildings and then cost-effectively survey them. So we use that. As I mentioned, our business model is to partner with big existing landlords and survey their portfolio. So let's take an example. We work with a big housing association. They own 5,000 homes throughout London across 300 buildings. We will survey those buildings and work out where the opportunities and constraints exist. And then through that, we then develop each project is bespoke, but there are principles that we apply to each one that can be standardized. And the main principle, to your point around access and structure, is that we've developed something called, that we refer to as an exoskeleton. So that's a frame that can sit either inside or outside of the building, but circumvents two of the three key constraints. And those three key constraints are structure. As lots of buildings can take additional stories, but good structural engineers will often shy away from it. The second is services. So often you have obviously things like waste and power, etc., which you need to mix up and down. And the third is access. And so this exoskeleton solution allows you to, it's not necessarily a silver bullet and it's not applicable in every scenario, but allows you often to circumvent those three primary constraints. But then there are other things like rights to light, that you do just have to work through as you would do a typical kind of RIBA stages project.
Brilliant, thank you. It's fascinating. It's like, this is the future. Fantastic, thank you.
I think lots of, and I like the title of the course around futures. I think it's one of the potential outcomes.
Brilliant, thanks.
I think there's one more question. So if we have that question, then we will move on to our second presentation. So Chloe, you've got your hand raised.
Hi, yeah. It's just a quick question in regards to the proposal. So, well, why did you decide to sort of do this scheme where it's affordable housing for key workers? I mean, was there research carried out that key workers sort of don't live in affordable housing? It's only because at the moment, obviously, there's bit of a job crisis for people that aren't key workers. They're sort of essentially the people that are guaranteed income at the moment. Yeah, so it was just a curiosity, really.
Yeah, great question as well. And yeah, we often actually get the question from at the other end of the spectrum as well. Again, why key workers, but more from the perspective from some of our investors or potential investors saying, you know, these are far too nice for key workers. Why would you, you know, one of our projects, for example, is right in just, 2-minute walk from Trafalgar Square. You could sell these flats for £10 million. Why are you doing them at affordable prices to key workers? So I'll kind of try and address both elements of that. So as I say, we started the company in 2018 writing this white paper, and hopefully, Matthew, you can circulate a link to that afterwards, where we go into this in granular detail. But broadly, the idea is around key workers currently aren't addressed in any housing policy or any affordability metrics. They're primarily from a economic basis, and by definition, often they won't be able to qualify for things like social housing because by being a key worker, they are in work and therefore sometimes will often fall outside specific criteria for it. So it's been many decades since there's been a specific key worker housing policy. And our theory of change is saying that at the moment, for a key worker to be able to work in the city, they will have to be near a city. They often have jobs like being a firefighter or a doctor where you've got to get to work. Unlike, like I'm, for example, a knowledge worker, I can work more or less from anywhere because I'm doing a lot of my work on a computer, say, whereas they need to get to a physical place of work. This means that they are tied to the economics of that city. And that often means that they either have to suffer incredibly expensive housing and or suffer very, very expensive commuting times. And there's a lot of data around what that looks like practically. So, for example, one definition of housing poverty, which I'm most in favour of, is what percentage of your income you spend on housing. And most key workers spend well over 50% of their income on housing. In addition to that, a lot of key workers suffer very, very long commuting times and very expensive commutes. There was a study by the Royal College of Nursing done earlier this year, which estimated that 54% of, through the survey, I think they surveyed about 3,000 London nurses, and 54% of London nurses were not only thinking of leaving London due to the cost of housing, but were actually thinking of leaving the profession of nursing overall because of the cost of housing. And that's with an average commuting time of about 90 minutes each day. And so there's a very kind of specific acute problem as to why key workers, in terms of the demand for housing for key workers. And then in addition to that, there's a element around the architectural typology we then ended up on, which is airspace above existing buildings. And the biggest challenge that developers generally face, but also any form of what I'm going to call NIMBYism faces, is around the trust about who your new neighbour is going to be and how your developer is going to behave through that process. So a lot of people, if they were to, it's the fear of the unknown and fear of the contract or social contract you're entering into with your developer and or your new neighbour, which means that a lot of people are resistant to it. And key workers are on almost, again, this is in the white paper, but on almost every survey, key workers are the most trusted members of our society. Nurses and doctors have approval ratings of over 90% and trust ratings of over 90% versus politicians. This is a 2018 survey, so I dread to think what it is now. It's probably kind of 99.9%. Politicians at the time were about 12%. They're probably down at kind of 0.12% now. But they, for a whole bunch of complex societal reasons, they are incredibly well respected. They're the professions that if you survey 15-year-olds, they're the most aspirational in society, and also they're the most trusted in society. And so the idea being that if you are going to have a generic new neighbour, the thesis we started off with was that if you would have a generic new neighbour, you wouldn't want a unknown private sector neighbour or an unknown social rented neighbour. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that's, again, a complex issue that I'm not looking to debate now, but key workers are are statistically the most trusted, and so we're looking to provide that ease that barrier to entry again in terms of the development typology.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Arthur. It's fascinating the way that you've targeted the market, how you talked about it being a thesis and a theory of change, which I think is very apt for the way that we're trying to explore some of these issues as well, and thinking of things systemically. I think is fascinating. So let's move on to our second presentation. So I'd like to welcome Kim Swallowe from Cherwell District Council's Build team. Kim's going to kick off the first part of this conversation, and I'm going to follow on to talk about the work that we've been doing here in the school as part of the project. So Kim, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm just going to get my slides up. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, brilliant. So as Matt mentioned, I'm an architect and I act as design lead for Build at Cherwell District Council. Build is an in-house programme that was set up in 2010 to deliver affordable housing across the district. We're motivated by a strong belief that everyone deserves a decent place to live and that there should be better options for those on low incomes. We needed to respond to a growing housing need at a time of less public resources, so we needed to get creative and think about ways that we could cut the cost of housing without sacrificing on quality. So how did we do this? Well, part of our solution has been to look at self-build, as Matt mentioned. The reason for this is that self-build is generally built to a better quality. It's better suits the needs of its users, but also there's a potential there to make huge savings on the upfront cost of a house. So for example, this graphic here, produced by the National Self-Build Association back in 2012, shows that the average price of a self-built home is nearly half of that of a completed home bought from a volume house builder. So we're not talking about small sums here. And these savings are partly possible due to the generation of sweat equity, but also due to the fact that on self-build schemes, there's no developer's profit, which is typically 20%, but can be as much as 40% of the cost of a home. So by way of an example, one of the first schemes that we looked at was this project by a guy called Dominic Stevens. It was built in Ireland. And by using a simple timber frame and doing much of the work himself, he managed to build a pretty good 3-bed house for less than 25k. And that includes a double height living and dining area and a separate kitchen. So inspired by projects like this, we thought, we're really onto something, but was there a local demand? Would anyone be up for it? So to find out, we cobbled together this flyer, which we sent out, and within a couple of days we had hundreds of responses. So it was really at this point that we knew that there was a real unmet need and that there was value in what we were proposing. So to get things going, we set up our own construction training centre where our residents learnt things like plasterboarding, carpentry, kitchen fitting and tiling. And to give you an idea of the kind of things we've done, this is a scheme in Bicester called Newton Close. It consists of 21 watertight shells. By that I mean a unit that's structurally sound, but that doesn't have anything on the inside. And then the residents were responsible for coming in and fitting out the properties themselves. And in return for their effort or their sweat equity, they were given a 10k discount on the purchase value of their home. So schemes like this and the lessons learnt that paved the way to a much larger scheme called Graven Hill in Bicester. You may have heard of it because there was a grand design series last year on it called The Street. And this series documented the stories of the first 10 households on the site. But it's actually a much larger site of 1,900 units. It's the UK's largest self and custom build site. But what's really exciting to me about this project is the way that we set it up. And the land allocation. So everything was done under something called a local development order, which essentially gave blanket planning approval for all the self-build plots on the site. That was all made possible by a document called a design code. which stipulates the rules of that local development order. And I actually wrote this design code, and I'm really happy to talk about that at the end or during another debate if it's of interest. So far, the programme has delivered over 260 homes. And as a team, we really feel that self-build has an important part to play in increasing the options available to people on low incomes. It doesn't by any means replace volume house building, the need for off-site systems or other standard forms of affordable housing. But because of its ability to better meet the needs of individuals that live in the properties and the ability to save on the upfront costs, we do think it's an important part of the overall mix. But there's no point building something and helping people to secure a home that's cost effective up front if it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to run. So more recently, we've been looking at the fabric performance of our buildings. And this is one of our first passive house schemes that we built, called Hope Close in Banbury. Now, the passive house standard is meant to be so good that you don't need heating at all, that just turning on your hairdryer is enough to get it up to a comfortable temperature. But this was 11 units, and we're aiming for a 90% reduction on heating bills, not 100%, which is brilliant because it means that residents have all this extra expendable income, which they can then spend on things that matter, like clothing and food. And whilst we wanted to incorporate self-build into the scheme, because of the accuracies required in meeting standards like this, it just wasn't possible. So that got us thinking, what if we came up with our own solution, our own self-buildable passive house system that both tradesmen and novice builders alike could use? And that's where our work started with Birmingham. And I'm going to pass you over to Matt now, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the project we've been working on for the past couple of years with their students. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, can you see that? Okay. So the project that we developed in collaboration with Kim and the Cherwell build team was called Real Homes, Real People. And it's gone through a couple of iterations now as we've refined and tested what we were doing. The first phase was a collab project. So as most of you are level 4 students, this is a module that you take in level 5, which is a collaborative live project module. And so we had students from undergraduate and postgraduate architecture and undergraduate interior architecture and design working together to look at developing a self-build system for low carbon housing. So we started off and we went to the council offices for a briefing, and we toured Graven Hill, which, as Kim said, is the UK's largest self-build site. And then we kicked off the project doing research into self-build construction, timber frame construction systems, low carbon technical solutions, and healthy materials. What we were aiming for was to design and try and resolve a repeatable house type that could be applied to a site and to explore the technical resolution of that through a large-scale mock-up. So this was the site that Kim asked us to work on, and it's a small site of about 580 square meters located to the south of Bicester town centre. It was selected as a sort of ideal typical site. Small regeneration sites like this are common amongst councils, and very often they're allocated for affordable housing. It's a site that was owned by Cherwell District Council, currently occupied by a vacant library building, which is due to be demolished to make way for this new housing. And it's in an area with a mix of housing types all the way from medieval cottages through to 1960s bungalows. So the students set out to develop a house type that would meet the various requirements in terms of access and regulation and so forth. And what they started to develop alongside this, and this is where this never actually plays, there we go, alongside this was an idea about the technical resolution of this project. And this was really where a lot of the effort went into that technical resolution. And this is a model that the student group made, looking at how that house could be built. And the idea was that we'd used material that was readily available. You can get that material from a DIY store. It was made into what's called a Larson truss, which is where there are 2 vertical timbers for each post. And that means you can insulate between the posts, so it has a really good thermal performance. And you would build that up floor by floor as you go up through the building. So the idea of that was to demonstrate that it'd be possible to incorporate self-build timber frame with an aim for passive house equivalence. So the final part of this first phase of the project was for students to create a detailed mock-up at 1-to-1 and to test a complex junction. And so these are students who had very limited experience of making and limited on-site experience. And so it was a really good test of how people could self-build the system, how easy it was to design and construct, and the sorts of tools and techniques that people might be using. So this 1-to-1 system mock-up of the system also showed some of the challenges, particularly around the ground floor and casting the concrete slab, and also in order to achieve the level of air tightness required to meet passive house equivalence. So we think that the experience we've had on this suggests that specialist input might be needed in these stages of the project, and we're now looking at alternatives to this to mitigate against this. So while the collab explored that one key detail, further work was needed to really gain an understanding of all of the key details in the system, particularly the upper floor junction and the roof junction. So we developed a plan to expand the collab through a technical module called Technical Investigation for 3rd-year architecture students, and it included a number of continuing collab students. So the module output asked students to prototype key components of the system as a further proof of concept, and to integrate the structural frame developed in the first module. So it was really about testing the junctions, trying out how it would work at different points in the building, and also making at 1-to-2 scale, connecting between large scale drawing and sketch work and the material impact of the decisions at large scale. We also had input from specialists, including Clancy Consult and Ecological Building Systems, to help refine this. This is, you can see here, one of the final models for the intermediate floor junction, which is perhaps the best resolved of the 4 junctions that were tested. And you can see is EPS is a more natural insulation, but due to time pressures we couldn't do this. Also what they showed, and you can see in the dotted red line here, was the challenge of achieving air tightness around the joint where the joist penetrates into the wall. So there's still some fine-tuning of the system needed. And also the roof detail was simplified at this point into a standard pitched roof with joists spanning between the party walls, but it creates some awkward details. So again, making amendments like spanning the joists from the ridge to the eaves would simplify the detail and make it more suited to a self-build process. So we've currently run 2 projects on this, and we're now looking to try and develop that further, to expand the collab and technical investigation module out further, and to look at how we can develop this on and test it out. Kim, is there anything you want to finish off on to wrap up?
Just that we've got a couple of sites which we are looking at allocating to prototyping this, which I think is really exciting, because that means we'll probably get the team down there building for the day, and hopefully some of the lecturers and students. So yeah, just really excited about next year and what we might be able to do.
Okay, so that's both of our presentations for today, looking at different approaches to how we might think about housing provision. Perhaps, I know, Arthur, you've got to go in a few minutes, but perhaps if there are any questions from anyone in the room, we can discuss those before you have to leave.
No questions. That's always a worrying sign.
What are the particular objectives of the winter project that they're going to be working on?
The projects that the students are working on. Well, I think it's been developed for both with level 4 architecture, which Victoria and Ollie, who's also in the call, lead, and we're looking at it on future living as well. But it's, I suppose, really the first, for those students, a very first quick design project looking at how you might start to understand scale and space, the sorts of things you might need to live, and how you can make that in a very small scale, compact dwelling, I suppose. With future living, we've been doing a few projects that explore those ideas and ideas to do with sort of transformable structures and architecture, compact living. But this is more of a sort of cross year group project to look at some of these issues.
It's interesting though, if you don't mind me jumping in, because I think this is probably one of the first talks that I've been across in a long time where you realise we've got brilliant architects out there, we've got fantastic designers out there, we've got people who want to do the right thing, and even in industry, because we're doing modular housing and factory built housing, off-site manufactured housing, accelerated construction housing, whatever you want to call it these days, and we can build pretty amazing houses for a very low cost. The problem is the land price. And it's really interesting that we've seen two great scenarios, one which reduces that land price because you're building in the air, and then secondly, another option that reduces labour cost to get the house as cheaply as possible. And that's through sweat equity, which is brilliant. I mean, that's why the £1 house and schemes in Stoke-on-Trent and Gateshead worked, because they were in effect self-build projects. And so, you were dependent on your brother or your dad or your mom or whoever who could put a cabinet together or do a bit of electrics and plumbing for you. And it's brilliant. What's tragic is this has been going on around the rest of the world for years, quite a long time actually. Places like New York, where they've been kind of using air as much as possible on very expensive land to build on top of each other. And when it comes to self-builds, I mean, I was in New Zealand many years ago, and I was just riding past a site on a motorbike. I was there for filming, and I saw the classic kind of developer hoarding and flagpoles and all of the phrases about how this was going to be a wonderful place to live. And I thought I'll pop in and have a look at the show houses and see what they're selling. And when I said, can I see one of your houses? They said, oh, no, we don't build houses. It's all self-build. We just sell plots. And they were writing design codes and pattern books, if you like, for the scale of those houses and roughly what they could look like and the materials that you could use with a bit of flexibility. And it's kind of mad that it's taken us this long to catch up. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I'm thrilled that it's happening, because you've got to be inventive and think outside the box to be able to make these things affordable. Because otherwise, and I've already slagged off the big house building industry, which I get in trouble for all the time. They will just buy chunks of land on the outskirts of any town or village or city. They will build the relatively lowest cost denominator to sell it for the maximum value. And so a lot of it's not decent placemaking and decent design, and they want to get in and build and get out. And I think what's fantastic about this, particularly with the self-build, is that people who are doing that are building their own homes. So they take a huge amount of pride and satisfaction in that. And they're learning skills along the way that they can then apply for all sorts of other retrofit work they could do on their new build house in years to come. So it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
And it's built to a better quality.
Absolutely. Absolutely, no doubt about it.
The,
Brilliant stuff.
The key thing there, I think, is the misnomer of, and again, I think bashing them is often unfair because they're just playing into the system that they're operating on a different set of rules. But yeah, even to call them house builders is a bit of a misnomer, because there's a great New Economics Foundation report last year. Almost all of the profits from volume house builders comes from land banking, and that big strategic, they call it strategic land, is the kind of, if you're a big part, again, for all the students on the call, is that you need to learn to decode a lot of things in the world generally, but also in development and legalese and all the rest of it. So strategic land means we're going to make money in 10 years from land we buy now, or 20 years from land we buy now. So land banking is where almost all the profit from volume house builders is coming from, and that they sometimes really will release equity either by selling strategic land or by slowly developing over phases, maybe over a decade or two, a very, very large project. But that's a kind of a side gig to the main event.
Yeah, one thing we haven't talked about today, actually, which the students should look into, is things like community land trusts as well. So there are some other wonderful, quite entrepreneurial ways that people can get good quality, low cost housing built. Oh, you're on mute, Matthew.
Yes. There was a question from Kyle, but I think his hand has gone down.
I might put it back up. Kyle?
Yeah. Oh.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, it was just I was just wondering if you changed your outlook to who the essential workers were since lockdown for your business.
Yeah, so, yeah, great question, Carl. And yeah, when we kind of set off in 2018 with the white paper and talking about key workers, we would meet with kind of very senior people, including housing ministers and Mayor of London, and everyone looked slightly confused as to why key workers were even being spoken about in terms of housing. And then since lockdown, kind of everyone and their dog is excited about key worker housing. So I think the broad mood music is good in terms of it being on the agenda, but there's quite a lot of jumping on the bandwagon. Specifically, we work to the government definition of key worker, which is different, I think, from the kind of nomenclature of essential worker, which has become kind of common parlance in lockdown. And so it's kind of splitting hairs, but we differentiate between essential workers, which I think we'd kind of recognise as bus drivers and supermarkets workers and people who need to be on the front line and do amazing work and hard work. Our specific focus, however, is key workers. So your kind of what I call your kind of children's book professions, like doctors, teachers, firefighters, nurses, etc. And we take the central government definition of what they define as a key worker for it. And that's really just because we as Skyroom, we're a small company, we don't want to have a dog in that fight in terms of kind of arguing around the edges or getting in kind of contentious debates about who and who is not a key worker. It's not our decision to make. We just say we're going to take what the government says and build for that specific tenure type.
It is staggering, though. I mean, I understand, Arthur, why you do that for your business model. Otherwise, it would just become too big and too complicated. But I think I just touched on it slightly about the affordability crisis generally. And even if you look beyond key workers, when the average price of a home might have been 3.5 times your salary in the 70s and the 80s, it's now 7.5, 8, 9, 10, 12 times the average salary. In London, it can be 46 times the average salary, which is obviously a crazy bubble. But it's frightening, really, when you think how much house prices have gone up in comparison with the costs of other products. I think someone said if the cost of food had grown at the same level as the inflation costs of houses, a standard chicken would cost 52 quid. And I'm not sure any of us would pay £52 for a standard chicken from the supermarket. And it is nuts. It's actually frightening in some ways, and it is because of that crazy increase in land. And then you could have lots of other debates about, have we built on enough land? There's arguments where people say we should release 3 to 4% of land for building on, and that would solve the housing crisis. That's a debate for another day. And also about the issues of where we build houses. So geographically, obviously we're building where there's demand, and where there tends to be demand is where there's jobs. And you could argue that there's many places, like my home city in the northeast, in Sunderland, where there's loads of land to build on, loads of cheap land to build on, but it's not necessarily a desirable place to live because there isn't the infrastructure or the jobs there. And I think that's a much wider discussion to be had in terms of, I mean, it ties in with finance and money really, but it's also about jobs and where you want to live. And I think what's quite interesting is when sometimes the places which were less desirable and very affordable can turn and become very attractive places to live because young people go there and then become entrepreneurial and set up their businesses and might get low levels of rent in their office spaces. The tragic thing there is they often get gentrified and then become unaffordable again, but at least they've shifted and at least they've moved, and hopefully there'll be a ripple effect to other places. I did the master plan for Margate back in 1998. And even I didn't think Margate would ever turn when I was designing the master plan. And you look at it now, it's fantastic, but it's mainly come about because of the high-speed rail link from St. Pancras and people moving out from London and then think, well, hang on, I can be by the sea and it won't take me long to commute in. Personally, I'm hoping off the back of COVID because people are working from home more. And actually some big organizations have said, don't come back to work, just work from home. We're going to reduce our office space, our overheads, stay at home. You're going to save time in terms of travel. You're going to save money on your rail tickets. I'm hoping then that people say, well, actually, do you know what? I'm going to go and live in that remote place that I would never have worked in before because you can do remote work. And it's not going to work for everyone, but I think there is going to be a change with that.
We've got a few questions. Arthur, do you need to head off?
Unfortunately, I've got a dash. But thank you very, very much for the invitation.
Arthur, thank you very much.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank
and
you.
look forward to hearing more about your projects as they evolve. I'd love to see the outcomes after the winter break. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sounds very interesting.
Okay, we've still got a couple of hands up. So I think Ollie, you were first with a hand up there.
All right. Yeah. Hi. It was kind of.
Hopefully, it wasn't a question for Arthur. It was a question for Arthur.
It was partly towards Arthur, but I think we might be able to discuss it more generally. I think permitted development often gets a really, really bad name, and often for very good reasons, because you can take horrible shortcuts and impose really sour standards of living upon different people. But there was a recent kind of update to it which looked at developing on the rooftops of mid-story buildings. And my question for Arthur was going to be kind of, is there an ideal rooftop and are these things now under more demand? But I wonder kind of, George as well, I mean, if you have any thoughts on that, because I know you've looked in a lot of detail at permitted development, and I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, or is it, I suppose?
Well, I mean, I've been calling for changes in the planning system for a long, long time. And for a planning system that would be pro-development rather than anti-development, which is what it used to be. I also called for permitted development rights in some form as well, because I did think that we had a planning system that was being under-resourced and overworked by many, many applications where you think, really, should this be taking a planner's time? Some of it's kind of quite straightforward, to be honest with you. I mean, we've had permitted development rights on standard buildings for some time, you know, that you're able to do a loft conversion, for example, or build an extension of a certain size on the permitted development rights. And I think that worked very, very well, to be honest, really well. Obviously, permitted development now in terms of turning kind of commercial buildings into residential buildings and just being able to get on and do that without any planning whatsoever might sound great in terms of fueling the property market and getting homes built quickly. But as you've seen, and I made a program about it, some of it is horrendous, absolutely horrendous. There's been a few changes recently in terms of space standards to improve that. But, you know, the problem is that when you relax any system, it's always going to be open to abuse by somebody somewhere. So, you know, a good developer is always going to do a good job, even under permitted development rights, because they have standards that they want to meet just for themselves because they want to sell a quality product. You're always going to get someone who's going to build something cheaper or worse. It's just going to, the system has been abused. The problem is it's been abused on a big scale. And it comes back to what I was saying before, that in some ways housing has been seen as something that's a commodity where you can make maximum profits, big profits very, very quickly, which means everyone jumps on the bandwagon. Anybody can build a house. Anyone can call themselves a developer. Anybody. You could set up a development company tomorrow and just say, I am a developer. You don't really have to be checked. You don't really have to be certified. You know, you can do a bit of a land deal. You could take some architects on, hopefully, because many don't even take on architects. It always made me laugh when the architectural profession wanted to protect the term architect. And the RIBA spent millions and millions of pounds doing that. But anyone can build a building and anyone can design a building. It's not like saying you're a doctor or a surgeon and then just carrying out surgery on someone when you're not. You can't do that, you know? So a PDR is a great example of where I think it was well intentioned to make things easier, but it's been abused. And I think there's ways of getting over that quite quickly that the government can do by bringing in minimum standards, minimum design standards, minimum space standards, minimum build quality standards, minimum ecological standards, and say, look, if you meet all of this and it's there laid out in a very distinct design code, then you can do it under permitted development rights. If you don't conform to those standards, then you can't sell those properties because they're never going to be signed off. And I think that's what you'd have to do. You've got to raise the minimum standard. And it's interesting. I didn't talk about this with Arthur because I wanted him to kind of have more time. But there's always this thing with the industry that the big house builders fight with government. So when government try to raise standards too high, they get a lot of resistance from the big house builders who will basically say, well, if you do that, you're going to push up house prices. And every minister goes, well, you know, I don't want to be responsible for that, even though they jump up anyway. You know, they're still massively overinflated. And I've always thought that I've hoped, and this might be naive of me actually, I've always hoped that if you raise standards across the bar, that hopefully what would happen is land prices would drop. Because basically land is sold based on build cost, profit. And so when someone puts in a bid, they're looking at their build cost, they're looking at their profit and, you know, any other associated costs. And then they'll put in what they think is the best bid. And as we know, in most walks of life, people take the highest offer. So if you've taken the highest offer, then someone's got less money to build a better product. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. If someone got so I'll give you an example. Actually, there was a bid that we won on a site with Homes England, and ours was the lowest bid. Now that was like revolutionary for Homes England to accept the lowest tender for a piece of land. But it's because they'd set very, very high standards and we said we would meet them. And we went beyond them, to be honest with you. So they said, look, if you're going to build to that amazing quality, we'll send the land to you for less. But that's Homes England land. You're not going to get many private landowners who are going to be so gracious. But I do think that if, as Arthur was saying, if land values are going absolutely ridiculously through the roof, that if the government legislate for much higher build quality or environmental qualities, which we we absolutely have to do it to meet our zero carbon targets. Then what should happen is everyone will say, right, our build costs have gone up. We're still going to take the same profit. Therefore, our bid for this piece of land is going to be less. That's not going to bring down house prices, but it's going to push up quality.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
It's interesting. I mean, I wonder if in trying to resolve the shortcuts taken with PDR, part of the answer is that it's not a planning issue, but it's just a building regs issue.
I kind of agree with that. I think it is a building regs issue, but it's, yeah. I mean, building regs, you could say, is based on space planning as well and volume and everything else. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's hard to deal with planning when it comes to PDR, certainly on the conversion of commercial buildings, because every commercial building generally looks different. You know, it can look very, very different. But I think when developers are squeezing in little rabbit hutches and some that have got rooms that don't have windows, don't have any view out whatsoever, and I'm not talking about bathrooms here, I'm talking about bedrooms that have no windows. That's horrendous. You know, the psychological damage that can have on someone is just ridiculous. We shouldn't be doing that in the 21st century. But I think you're right. That is a building regulations issue, because you could say every room has to have natural light. Maybe you have to speculate that it has to have a window of a certain size. You know, that it has to have a minimum space standard, that it has to have certain air quality. And so I think you're right. It's a building regs issue. But that's, again, PDR allows people to pull all sorts of stunts that they shouldn't really be allowed to do. So I'm not against it. I think it's good to have it, but I think it needs to be massively improved.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder if, Kim, do you have any thoughts on that from your experience at Cherwell and with Graven Hill about the impact of design codes and so forth?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, like one of the biggest issues, I totally agree, it's the building regs issue as much as anything else, is the fact that permitted development is a national order. It doesn't think about context or a particular building itself. So if you look at sort of the level of a design code and looking either at a particular site or a particular building, then I think you'll be much able to protect what matters to that project.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got another couple of hands up, so should we go to James next?
Hi there, just a quick question for George Clarke, if possible. Building on the previous question from Ollie, I was just wondering if, on the information that you said about different developers influencing government decisions possibly, or exerting possible power over the industry, if you think the architect has almost lost control of the market to an extent, and if you think that there's a level of control over the architect which has resulted in the British market being so far behind the standards of, say, the Scandinavian market or somewhere with high quality regulations and building standards.
So this is a tricky one, because you're basically, that's a big question about the position and role of an architect in the industry these days. And I could talk for hours about that, to be honest with you. Back in the day, the architect used to be called the master builder. Simon Sharma, the historian, signed a book for me recently, and he said, to George Clarke, the master builder. He didn't call me an architect. And the architect used to be in control of every single part of the process. In a modern world with complicated buildings, there's no way that we could carry on doing that. And that's why other professions were formed in the industry, and rightly so. Absolutely rightly so. In some ways, I think it's about, it's a cultural thing. I think sometimes about the industry, because if you get a very good client, whoever that may be, whether it's a private client or a housing association or a council, if they set a standard that they want to do something very, very well, they will automatically go to a very good architect. And as we know, it's a fantastic architect with a fantastic client, and they've set a level of ambition, even if it's a tight budget, even if it's a really difficult budget. If the ambition's there and there's the will to do the right thing, then there will always be a good scheme that comes out of it. I think one thing that all architects are very, very good at, once they get a bit of experience under their belt, and because we love our jobs and we're probably overcommitted sometimes, we're not like lawyers. We don't hit the clock and then charge by the millisecond. You know, we put in an awful lot of work that we can't or normally don't bill for, because we want to do a really good job. And to do a cheap scheme that's good means you've got to work 10 times harder. And ironically, if you're on a percentage fee basis, you get less money, because you're working really hard on a really affordable scheme, if you like, to do something really good, and you're getting a low fee for it. If you got paid on an hourly basis or a day rate or whatever, then fine, you put in as much time as you want. And I think when you've got that client team relationship, I'm going to say team rather than just the architects. If you've got a client team relationship, then the architect's in a very good position, and the building normally becomes a great success. How many projects I've turned up on and people just think the architect's a pain in the backside, and he or she's going to make all of these changes, that's just going to cost us more money and it's going to take more time. And actually, that's not really the case. We just want to do something that's really good. And so I think that kind of stems from the client more than anything else. I agree with you in some ways that the architect has lost its old traditional position.
Would you say it needs to be
sorry.
Would you say it needs to be a harmony between the different industries then, across the construction industry as well as the design industry? And would you say that?
I mean, look, if I was going to criticize our industry, I think I do think that we've lost some of the skills that we used to have. That, I know this is a very generic point to make, so I might get myself in trouble. But you know, there is a kind of perception sometimes that we're the ones that do the pretty pictures and make things look nice. which isn't true. You know, I mean, we do much more than that. But some project managers out there or some clients might think that we really don't understand costs or land values or things like that as much as we really should. And on some projects, I would agree with that. And the architect seems to have just an aesthetic role rather than actually really creating the nuts and bolts of the building and every single part of it in terms of how it's delivered. And so I don't know, I think we've lost our way a little bit, but I think there are other professions out there that can help and support us do that. It's all about how the client and the profession build that team. If you've got a bad client, you're going to get a bad building. I can tell you that absolutely right now. You know, great clients deliver great buildings. They're really, really good, irrespective of the budget. I can guarantee it'll still be a very good building.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, we've got another question. Next hand up, I think, was Rob.
All right, thanks, Matthew. I think my question's for Kim. Interested in her experience at Cherwell in terms of demographics. I was reflecting on the slight conflict in the two presentations between thinking about self-build techniques and key workers. Key workers aren't exactly people you would expect to be time-rich, perhaps, yet self-build methodologies require you to be time-rich with swapping costs and values for something else in labour. And I know from a bit of personal experience on custom build projects that I've worked on in practice that these questions tend to skew the demographics for those that are able to access these self-build questions. So I'd just be interested to hear from Kim what sort of experience she's had on Cherwell and the types of people that are able to access these sites.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to be really honest with my answer to this. I've been speaking to the Right to Build task force for a while because unfortunately, self-build in the UK is still very much skewed towards wealthy individuals. There aren't many options available there for people on no incomes, and that's why the work that we're doing with Birmingham at the moment I'm so excited about, because I think this is bringing forward a system which hopefully will be really easy for people to use themselves to benefit from that sweat equity. But we're also looking at how the building operates as well. So even if they were to do it on a custom build approach and they got a tradesman to build it themselves, we're trying to build the cost of the system down so that they can actually access this opportunity, which I think is totally doable, but also then make it so that it's a property which is easy to use and that's cheap to run as well. So you're absolutely correct. We're working really hard at the moment to open that up because I think it's really important, and I think actually as an industry we would have failed if we don't open self-build up to those on their incomes, because like George says, in countries abroad it's sort of 80% of the houses built in most of Europe are done through self-build. So we're really far behind, and if we could get anywhere near that, I'd be really pleased.
Okay, thank you.
I could have made some comment about grand designs off the back of that, but I won't.
Well, yeah, that's kind of where I was going.
It was one thing when they did the program as well. It was one thing that we were, really aware of, that it does have this, image, and I think that's just, it's part of a, it's a brand really in itself, isn't it? And during the program, we did try to have a range of demographic, but still, I think it could be pushed further, and I think that the industry has a long way to go.
To connect that to connect the early talk, one of the challenges there as well that I found is again on land value, and I've worked on custom build schemes before where there was the open market decided the land value for the custom build plots. Yeah. And interest and competition just pushed that land value then beyond the reach of the younger demographic. And the client in question had no appetite or fair mechanism to be seen to be controlling that. So that seems to be part of that conversation as well.
So one of the things that is coming forward that we've been working really hard on with the Right to Build task force is also help to build, which will hopefully mean that they'll be able to access sort of land on a shared ownership basis, like how you can buy a house on a shared ownership basis at the moment. So hopefully that will open it up as well. But I also just want to mention we've done fit out projects on apartments as well. So we've actually done social rent units where people have been able to generate a bit of sweat equity as well to get a reduction on their costs. So it doesn't have to be totally a home ownership thing, a freehold ownership idea. You know, and in other countries, apartments, self-built apartments is a bigger thing as you know, your sort of detached properties. So yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, but what I was just going to come in on, and it's probably not a very optimistic point really, is that because we've gone through this huge period of inflation where property values and land values they're insane, aren't they? I mean, the number of people that you'll hear said, oh, I bought my house in 1997 and it's now worth 6 times more. Well, yeah, great for them, brilliant for them, but that's just a reflection of how awful it's going to be for people of younger generations to get on the property ladder. And we're not just talking about young people either. I mean, the average age of the first time buyer in parts of Britain is 38, 39. You know, where back in the day it was 25, 26, 27. And we're not going to go backwards, to be honest, because we can't just all of a sudden reduce land values and reduce property costs, because it means 80% of the country will probably fall into negative equity, which would be really bad. So we are where we are. And this is, unless wages massively increase to catch up with house prices, we need to find very clever, very entrepreneurial and very different ways of being able to build houses, whether it's small scale homes, whether it's self-built homes, whether it's homes in the sky, taking air rights rather than land rights. We've got to do these things now. We have to do them now, because it's not just going to be a simple readjustment of salaries to house prices. And the thing that I don't know if anyone watched my council housing program last year. I mean, the thing that really kind of upsets me about the country quite a lot, really, is how people are kind of against council housing. There's this kind of slight snobbery about social housing. And you know, when I went to places like Vienna, yes, over 60% of the people that live in Vienna live in state-built rented housing. And it's really good. It's really, really good. But because our property prices have gone up so much and everyone's jumped on that bandwagon, landlords, private investors, you could argue the kind of double glazing salesman from the 1980s is probably now a developer or a landlord. Do you know what I mean? And everyone, car salesmen have jumped on the property game. Everyone's jumped on it. Everyone. I mean, Property Ladder, I couldn't bear watching that program when it came out, because the whole bit, I'm going to get in trouble saying that because it's a Channel 4 program. It drove me absolutely nuts. And Sarah Beanie used to have to put a little disclaimer in at the end saying, even if they'd done no work whatsoever, they would have still made the same profits, because that's how much house prices were jumping up by. So I think we've got to, we need to have this kind of cultural shift, I think, about how we perceive the class system in housing. I think we need to care a lot more. Grenfell is a I think absolutely symbolises a failed system, really, that didn't care at the level that it should have done. So I think we need to have these cultural shifts, and we need to care more, and we need to be kind of less snobby. I just think it's really interesting, Kim, your comment about, most people that build self-built houses are actually quite well off. They really genuinely are. Apart from the example of the guy that did the 25 grand house, that brilliant one that you showed, and the 3-bedroom 25 grand house was awesome. I love that, by the way, absolutely brilliant. But
there's quite a few examples like that around the UK of people that have done this.
Brilliant.
To escape the mortgage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it is possible.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've reached the end of the questions from what I can see, so perhaps that's a good point to lead on the need for care. Yeah, so thank you again to speakers, so Kim, Arthur and George for joining us and sort of leading on the discussion. But thank you all for your time, and hopefully that's given everyone some food for thought in terms of their development of their projects and the projects they might go on to do when they start looking at houses and housing going forward over the next year, I suppose, in both courses. So thank you all very much, and we're looking forward to seeing your rooftop homes on Friday. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.